Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in Kansas. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. The surviving documents surrounding what became known locally as the Cursed Farmer begin with a single property record dated September 1892, filed in Clay County, Kansas. The entry notes the sale of 80 acres of farmland from a widowed woman named Etta Holling to a man listed simply as J.L. Baird. Beyond his initials, the record gives little, yet later recollections from neighboring homesteads describe him as quiet, worn-looking, and newly arrived from somewhere east of Topeka. The barn still stood near a shallow creek and a patch of thin wheat that never took to the soil. Witnesses described the land as heavy with stillness, no livestock sounds, no laughter, only the wind against loose boards. At first, Baird drew little attention. The 1890s were lean years across the plains, a time when drought and poor harvests had already driven many to desperation. According to agricultural notes that would later feed into early studies of soil depletion, research that decades later helped shape what historians now connect to the Dust Bowl, the earth around Clay County had begun turning coarse and powdery. Baird's nearest neighbor, Amos Doolin, testified in 1896 that the ground there was pale as ash and dead to seed, as though cursed by what it had once fed. No one laughed when he said it. Most simply nodded. By late October 1892, locals had begun to whisper about strange lights flickering from the gaps in Baird's barn walls. Some said it was the lantern he used for work at odd hours. Others claimed they heard the rhythmic pounding of something metallic long after midnight. One passing rider told the town constable he saw Baird standing outside the barn door in the rain, staring into the earth at his feet, as if waiting for it to answer him. When the constable asked about it weeks later, Baird only said he was checking drainage. The phrase appeared again in an unfinished letter discovered years later, scrawled and never mailed. Old census lists and affidavits suggest he had once been a cooper's son from Illinois, but there were no official ties to any living relatives. His property taxes were always paid on time, and receipts show purchases from a local smithy, chains, nails, and notably a set of small iron hooks. No one found out what he used them for. In December, a traveling preacher named Reverend Asher Cole was said to have visited the farm, delivering both food and scripture to those he thought near ruin. His diary, recovered from church archives, contains a single line under that date. Visited Baird's place. He listened, but did not hear. The man's eyes were full of something hollow. In early January, the barn door was found ajar. The snow had drifted in, and faint marks, neither boots nor hooves, led from the doorway down toward the creek before fading under the frost. No one followed them then. Not yet. By February 1893, the winter had hardened the soil into a pale crust, and the town of Milford, only a few miles east, had nearly forgotten the quiet man by the creek. A new letter appeared in the post office that month, an inquiry from a supply merchant in Emporia, addressed to J.L. Baird, Clay County, near the old Holling property. It was returned unopened. Some said the farmer had gone to Junction City to sell tools, while others swore they had seen him still at his barn door, tending to nothing at all. A farmer's wife, Mrs. Adeline Crutch, told the county recorder that smoke from his chimney ceased mid-February, though faint lamplight still glimmered through the cracks at night, like an ember that won't go out. That phrasing stuck with investigators later when they tried to chart the timeline of his disappearance. The first real sign of alarm came from Reverend Cole, the same preacher who had visited months earlier. He returned after the thaw and wrote in his journal that the air around the property smelled of metal, as if rain had burned it. The barn's main latch was snapped. Its padlock lay half buried in mud. The Reverend opened the door, expecting silence. Instead, he heard a slow, uneven drip from somewhere below the floorboards. That detail would appear in multiple testimonies years later when court officials attempted to reconstruct the scene. Midway through the barn, hidden beneath stacked hay, he discovered a square cut of planks fitted roughly together. As he pried them loose, cold air rose from below, and with it came the scent of stagnant water and something far less natural. The Reverend lit his lamp and peered downward. It was not a root cellar or storage pit. It was a stairwell, narrow, crude, descending straight into the earth. His report described 7 steps before the light failed, the edges slick with moisture and streaked with soot. He refused to go further. That night he fetched Sheriff Dannel, who returned with 2 deputies and a local doctor named Ernest Claver. They descended as a group, lanterns in hand. According to Claver's later affidavit, the walls of the passage were rough-hewn clay, braced with mismatched boards. Several bore marks of fingernails, shallow and ragged. At the bottom, the space widened into a chamber no larger than a pantry. On its far wall hung a row of iron hooks, identical to those Baird had purchased the previous fall. Beneath them lay dark stains across packed earth that neither lantern light nor scraping could fully identify. Claver noted the smell of old blood, though he admitted it might have been rust. They found no body, no tools, and no trace of Baird. Only a small bound ledger resting on a barrel, its pages damp and nearly unreadable. A few lines survived. Soil does not take, something beneath refuses the seed. Drainage incomplete. Those fragments became the centerpiece of speculation for decades afterward. The sheriff sealed the property, but word of the find spread quickly through the county, and rumors grew of what else might have been buried in that stairwell. Some said it was a shelter from storms. Others whispered it was a place for confession of a different kind. Within weeks, the Baird property had become a morbid curiosity. Townsfolk who had once ignored the man now walked the edge of his fields, peering toward the barn as if expecting him to emerge and resume his strange routines. The constable stationed 2 men to keep watch, though no one approached after sundown. The land itself seemed to hum with tension, wind moaning through the split boards, wheat bending though the air was still. The Kansas newspapers carried a brief mention that spring under the heading, "Farmer Missing, Curious Pit Discovered." It was buried beneath reports of grain shortages and crop failures, the very hardships later studied in early agricultural bulletins that historians now link to the Dust Bowl's beginnings. Those official documents describe an invisible battle between man and soil, but they never mention what Clay County residents felt, that the ground could remember. In April 1893, Dr. Claver and Sheriff Dannel attempted a second descent into the cellar. This time they brought 2 lanterns and a rope for measurement. They recorded the chamber's dimensions, 6 feet across, 4 deep, and noted new seepage at one corner, as though water were rising from below. The barrel had shifted slightly since their first visit. Claver later testified that faint impressions, almost like the knees or palms of a person, were visible in the dirt near where it stood. Both men agreed to fill the pit, but heavy rain that week collapsed the upper steps, sealing it in mud before they could begin. The sheriff filed his report in May and closed the case under the term voluntary departure. It would have ended there if not for what surfaced 3 months later when a boy named Henry Doolin found something in the creek not far from the barn, a small tin key attached to a cord of leather. The family turned it over to the constable, who recognized it as identical to the missing padlock. Deus key. Henry's father testified that the boy had also mentioned seeing a shadow in the water, though he later admitted it might have been the reflection of clouds. The key was placed in the courthouse safe where it remains listed among unclaimed property in the 1894 inventory. New tenants briefly occupied the farmhouse that autumn, a couple named Mercer, who arrived from Salina with hopes of restoring the land. They stayed less than 2 weeks. Mrs. Mercer wrote to her sister, describing the sense of someone above us at night, walking through there's only roof. Their hired hand, Jacob Fry, refused to sleep in the barn after hearing what he swore were footsteps on the sealed planks. He told neighbors that the boards flexed under weight, but there was no one there. When the Mercers left, they did so quietly, abandoning their livestock to the open field. By winter, Reverend Cole had taken it upon himself to keep the property locked, visiting monthly with a prayer book and small hammer to check the boards. No trespassing signs appeared by spring 1894. The Reverend noted in his journal that wild grass grew unusually thick over the stairwell site, and that the earth beat warm when touched, even on frost mornings. Neither science nor sermon could account for it. That summer brought a dry heat that settled like dust over Clay County, cracking the fields and darkening the creeks. The Holling property, now referred to by most as Baird's Hollow, remained unclaimed. The courthouse ledger recorded a pending auction, but no one placed a bid. Several neighbors reported hearing hammering from the barn during July nights, though the constable's patrols found the doors chained shut. One affidavit by a ranch hand named Eli Warren stated he saw a glow as of a lantern buried beneath the floor, describing it as pale blue and unsteady. He added, "It was as if the earth itself breathed light." The sheriff dismissed it as phosphorescence from decaying vegetation, but the words lingered in local retellings. By late August, a traveling newspaperman from Topeka, Andrew Lister, arrived in town after reading of the case in an earlier column. He interviewed townspeople, visited the site with permission, and published a modest piece titled The Kansas Hollow Mystery. He wrote of the strange temperature of the ground, the warped boards, and the silence of the nearby fields. His notes included references to agricultural studies of the era, including the early soil erosion observations that scholars would later associate with the Dust Bowl's regional precursors. Lister's interest seemed scientific, yet those who met him claimed he became withdrawn after his third day on the property. He was seen pacing near the creek at dusk, muttering that someone was still below. He left abruptly, leaving his room key and a half-filled notebook at the inn. The pages contained sketches of the barn interior and a rough outline of the stairs, labeled only "Entrance to the Refused Soil." No one ever recovered the rest of his notes. In September, the local paper reported an incident involving a freight wagon overturned near the farm road. The driver, Thomas Greer, survived but CLE. The horses had reared suddenly as they passed the barn. They smelled something foul, he told deputies, something that wasn't there before. His statement, written in shaky pen, was filed but never followed up. The county marshal at the time, a man named Bertram Wade, ordered the structure sealed again and forbade entry under penalty of trespass. Yet it was clear few needed the warning. People simply stopped passing that way. Toward the end of 1894, the Reverend made what would be his final visit. The journal entry from November reads, "The house stands empty, the barn breathes still. I prayed over the ground and felt watched from above." That same week, a schoolteacher from nearby Longford claimed she saw a figure at the farmhouse window as she crossed the ridge at sunset. She described it as a man in work clothes, motionless, with light on his face, though the interior was dark. When she returned the next morning with her brother, the house was empty and the dust undisturbed. The report was filed under unverified sighting. The teacher never again took that road home. Through that winter, the barn's roof collapsed under snow, sealing what lay beneath. The town's new minister, a younger man named Redding, argued the ground should be sanctified, but permission never came. Officials considered the matter concluded. The farmer's name was slowly forgotten except in rumor: Baird, the man who listened to the soil. By early 1895, most residents of Clay County avoided the hollow altogether. Those who farmed nearby claimed the air carried a metallic tang after rain, and that livestock refused to graze near the fence line. A tax surveyor named Linus Kearney visited the site that March to reappraise the land for auction. His written statement, preserved in county archives, described the area as oddly subsiding, with the barn's remains sinking several inches lower than the surrounding field. He noted faint cracks spreading outward from the foundation, as though the ground itself had softened beneath something hollow. He also mentioned the faint odor of kerosene near the ruins, though no containers were found. Kearney's assistant, John Marple, later testified he heard a low tapping noise while taking measurements, 3 beats, a pause, then 3 again, but assumed it was dripping water. When the county tried once more to sell the property in June, the only interested party was a retired physician from Abilene, Dr. Hollis Trent, who expressed curiosity rather than intent to farm. Trent had studied soil composition and mental illness, believing environmental toxins could affect the mind. He obtained temporary custody of the property for scientific observation and moved into the farmhouse that July. According to letters to his colleague in Topeka, Trent spent most nights in the barn ruins, digging small trenches and collecting samples. He described finding clay like ash, nearly sterile of life. One evening he wrote that his lantern flickered as though the air below exhaled, and that he heard faint movement from under the hardened mud. His next note, dated July 19th, read, "Uneasy night, strange murmuring near the stair site, perhaps wind through the boards." There were no further entries. On July 25th, the constable visited after townsfolk reported smoke from the property. He found the farmhouse intact, but the barn smoldering. Trent's belongings were scattered outside, bedroll, shovel, journal, all damp from the dew. There was no sign of the man himself. The cellar area had collapsed into a shallow pit filled with blackened mud. A single boot, believed to be Trent's, was discovered half buried near the edge. A deputy remarked that it was as though he stepped out of it and vanished. The fire report listed unknown cause, and the matter was filed quietly, out of respect for Trent's reputation. By autumn, the site had become overgrown with weeds taller than a man. Water pooled where the barn had been, and frogs bred in the stagnant hollows. Neighbors complained of the smell, though by winter it had faded. Reverend Cole, now elderly, noted in his final entry before leaving the parish that, "Whatever lived there is sated." His phrase puzzled those who read it later. Some thought he meant the land had settled. Others believed he spoke of something else entirely. For several years afterward, the property remained unsold, appearing only in occasional ledger notes for unpaid taxes and fence repair claims. The people of Clay County resumed their routines, though any mention of Baird's Hollow still drew silence at the tavern tables. The young grew up hearing warnings not to trespass there, told in the same hushed tone as ghost stories, but older residents didn't laugh when they told it. In the spring of 1897, heavy rain swept through Clay County, flooding low fields and exposing what had long been buried. Baird's Hollow, neglected for 2 years, turned into a shallow lake of brown water and debris. When the floods receded, a group of farmhands discovered fragments of timber from the barn carried downstream, along with part of a barrel and several rusted hooks that matched those once described in Sheriff Dannell's affidavit. They were tangled in reeds along the creek bend, half covered in silt. The constable gathered the items and sent them to Junction City for cataloging, but the box was misplaced en route and never entered into the official record. The missing evidence became another small ghost in the growing folklore surrounding the hollow. By the end of that summer, 2 new families had settled within a few miles of the site. The Reeds, who lived west of the creek, told visitors that strange sounds traveled across the fields at night, hollow thuds, like a hammer striking wet wood. Mrs. Reed said it came in patterns as if someone were working below ground. Her husband dismissed it as the echo of rail construction from distant lines, but even he admitted it seemed too regular. Their hired hand, Simon Dale, quit after a single month, leaving behind his wages and tools. He told the constable, "It's the ground itself that listens there." His statement was filed but not investigated. That same year, an agricultural society from Topeka sent a young surveyor named Elias Boone to study soil consistency in drought-prone regions. Boone's surviving notes reference the hollow, remarking on subterranean cavities likely caused by root collapse or unrecorded wells. Yet one passage, later cited by a historian in 1915, reads, "There is vibration beneath the western edge of the field, irregular and faint, like a pulse." He stayed only 2 nights before continuing north. The loss. The sentence in his log simply says, "I understand now why the locals keep their distance." It was during this period that references to the case reappeared in local papers, sometimes tied to the early discussions of Kansas soil decline. the same environmental concerns that scholars now align with the formative years of the Dust Bowl decades later. Reporters used Baird's Hollow as an allegory, describing it as land that refused the plow. In this retelling, Baird was portrayed not as cursed, but as a man who listened too closely to what the earth could no longer bear to give. One editorial suggested his disappearance was a form of surrender to the silence of the plains. But among locals, the older story persisted. In taverns and parlor whispers, the details grew darker. Some claimed the unknown figure once seen at the farmhouse window still appeared during storms, its outline faint behind the glass. Others said the reflection could be caught for a moment on the surface of the flooded field if one stood still enough under lightning's flash. The constable dismissed such tales as frontier superstition. Yet, as records would later reveal, the man himself avoided that route entirely when riding patrol. The last formal entry regarding the Baird property appeared in 1898, when the land was absorbed into county holdings and marked as non-arable. It should have ended there, but stories that survive in oral recollection suggest the ground did not stay quiet for long. By 1899, Clay County's newer residents had little direct memory of the man named Baird, but the older farmers carried his story like a cautionary verse. They would say it softly over ledgers or while mending harnesses, as though speaking too loudly might wake something beneath the soil. That summer, a field hand named Ira Moffett leased a portion of the abandoned property for haying. He had heard only fragments of the tale and dismissed them as gossip. Moffett's first letters home described the land as stubborn, the plow catching on unseen roots or stones. He wrote, "It's as if the ground resents being opened." On his fourth week, he stopped writing altogether. When his employer visited in August, the man found the plow abandoned mid-row, the harness straps cut clean through. Moffett's bedroll was still inside the barn, dry and neatly folded. The constable searched for 2 days, but discovered only footprints circling the collapsed foundation, stopping abruptly near the old stair site. There were no tracks leading away. The incident reignited local unease, and by autumn the sheriff received a petition from surrounding landowners to fence the area permanently. The document, signed by 23 residents, cited persistent trespass and unwholesome odors. Funding delays kept the order from being executed that year, and the hollow remained open ground. Several months later, a frost came early, hardening the fields into dull stone. A small fire broke out near the reeds' pasture, no source ever found, and spread briefly toward the hollow before dying in a straight line at its edge, as if the earth itself refused to burn. That oddity appeared in a single newspaper paragraph titled, "Fire Meets Its Match." No explanation was given. Around that same time, Reverend Redding, who had succeeded the aging Cole, visited the hollow out of duty. He wrote to the diocesan office describing a sensation of tremor underfoot, not of the earth shifting, but of something moving within it. He confessed he cut the visit short and advised that no services be held there again. In his next sermon, delivered that winter, he spoke of sins buried deep enough to grow roots, a phrase parishioners later connected to the cursed farmland, though he never named it aloud. By 1901, the property was a ruin. The farmhouse roof collapsed, windows gaping like empty eyes. The county clerk noted that only chimney stones remained visible after snow. Children dared each other to touch the doorframe still half standing. A few swore they heard knocking from beneath the frost. Most families forbade them to go near it. One recorded affidavit from a man named August Leiter, dated 1902, recounts his visit to retrieve old fence posts. "The soil there sank beneath my boots," he wrote. "I felt heat rising through the mud, like breath from something trapped." His statement ends abruptly, and he added no further detail. Though no more official disappearances were linked to the site, references persisted in regional folklore collections compiled by early ethnographers from the University of Kansas. They described tales of a man who listened to the ground until it spoke back. The Baird case, though fading from newspapers, had become part of the state's oral mythology, a reminder of isolation, ruin, and the silent weight of the earth itself. In 1903, The county finally sold the land to a railway supply agent named Milton Cray, who had no interest in farming and sought only to strip old timber and salvage iron from the ruins. Cray brought with him 3 laborers and a wagon. The men worked through June, hauling beams from the barn remains and clearing brush along the creek. They camped near the site for 2 nights, before one of them, a young hand named Pierce Lohman, abruptly quit. He told Cray that he'd heard voices under the wagon at night, though no one else confirmed it. The next morning, the ground beneath their campfire had collapsed into a small hole, no wider than a barrel mouth. It was dry below, showing the top of what looked like the old stairwell's entrance, long thought buried. Cray ordered the hole filled, and the crew left the same week. He sold the iron at a fair price and never returned. In later correspondence with a friend in Manhattan, Kansas, Cray mentioned a smell of earth that still clings to my clothes, no matter the washing. That autumn, storms moved across the plains, flattening crops and flooding creeks. The hollow remained untouched by the water, as if elevated by invisible hands. A local farmer, Hiram Sloat, claimed lightning struck the chimney of the farmhouse, shattering it, yet when he approached the following day, he found the bricks scattered in a perfect circle. Not blasted outward, he wrote, but laid down as if placed. The phenomenon reached a short piece in the Junction City Sentinel under odd weather signs of Clay County, though editors attributed it to wind. In early 1904, a regional historian named Lydia Horn began collecting testimonies from older settlers for her volume Echoes of the Prairie Frontier. Among her handwritten notes, preserved in the university's archives, appears a section labeled simply The Baird Matter. She transcribed portions of Reverend Cole's surviving journals and Dr. Trent's correspondence, weaving them into a sober account of rural decline, superstition, and environmental hardship. Horn's work is one of the few sources to connect the story to the era's growing understanding of soil exhaustion, the same cycle of collapse that scholars later linked to the beginnings of the Dust Bowl. She wrote, "The earth beneath certain homesteads seemed to sigh before surrendering itself to dust. When questioned years later, she admitted she had visited the site only once and refused to describe what she'd seen there." After Horn's article circulated, interest in the hollow returned briefly. A few spiritualist groups from Wichita sent representatives, hoping to hold seances among the ruins. The constable turned them away, citing county trespass law, but one account survives from a member of the group who claimed they held the ritual from the road's edge instead. He described hearing a hammering far below, rhythmic and patient, like someone building where no floor remains. By 1906, new tenants had fenced the creek line for cattle, but they left that section untouched. The animals avoided it regardless, forming a perfect semicircle whenever driven near the boundary. The owner noted this pattern in his almanac margins with the comment, "They smell what we cannot." When later asked why he didn't sell the land, he said quietly, "Because no one should live there again." And still the ground continued to sink, inch by inch, as if drawing everything back into itself. By 1908, what had once been a hollow was now a shallow depression ringed by willow and coarse grass. Travelers along the road saw only a dark patch in the field, a place where sunlight seemed to hesitate before touching the ground. The farmhouse had fully collapsed, and only its foundation remained, half swallowed by mud. County maps from that year marked the site as abandoned, but an asterisk beside it indicates unreliable terrain. That note, written in red ink by the surveyor, was never explained in accompanying documents. Old residents of Clay County began dying out, taking their memories of Baird's farm with them. Only a few younger locals repeated the tale, mostly around harvest time, when drought or blight struck again. They would whisper, "The soil remembers." In 1909, a traveling peddler named Louis Harriman stayed one night near the area. He later recounted in a Junction City tavern that he'd seen a dim light burning where no house stands. He described it as a glow beneath the earth, not above it, and said he heard faint shoveling, slow and deliberate. His account was laughed off by the drinkers, but the barkeep, whose uncle had been one of the early deputies on the Baird case, refused to serve him another round. "We don't dig that story up here," he said, and ended the conversation. In 1910, a pair of county engineers were sent to measure flood risk after continued reports of soft soil and sinkage. Their notes, filed in Topeka, mention unusual heat pockets under the clay, possibly caused by trapped gas. One of the engineers, Henry F. Jaspers, later told a colleague that his compass spun erratically whenever he approached the center of the depression. He described feeling as though the ground pulsed once, like a heartbeat. He completed his report, but requested no further assignments in that district. That same year, a Kansas Agricultural Bulletin features read an article comparing cases of failed soil across the state. While never naming Baird's Hollow directly, it referenced a notorious Clay County parcel whose yield had ceased completely since the 1890s. The author, Professor Samuel Easton, speculated that underground combustion or mineral depletion might explain the phenomenon. But in a private letter to another researcher, later discovered in the university's archives, he added, "It is unlike any other field. It resists documentation. The instruments read silence." Locals continued to avoid the site, though a few dared approach during droughts to draw water from the creek. In 1911, a farmhand named Caleb Porter was found unconscious near the old boundary fence. When revived, he claimed he had seen a man standing where the farmhouse once stood, barefoot and covered in dust, looking straight at me. Porter fled, leaving his horse and tools behind. The constable who took his statement noted that Porter's boots were burned at the soles as if from standing on hot iron. The incident was dismissed as heat stroke, though several men later refused to work in that area. By 1912, the hollow had become a subject of curiosity among students from the nearby Normal School in Emporia, who gathered folklore for field assignments. One of them, a young woman named Alice Bram, visited and recorded hearing faint tapping beneath the soil, spaced in threes. Her notes end with a line that echoed across later retellings. If it was wind, it had rhythm. In the spring of 1913, a renewed push for settlement brought surveyors back to Clay County, and once again the hollow appeared on their ledgers, a blank square amid neatly parceled farmland. By then, only fragments of the barn structure remained, splintered beams, a few warped nails, and the faint outline of what had been the stairwell. The county proposed filling the depression with gravel to stabilize the ground for grazing, and a small team was sent with carts and shovels. Among them was a foreman named Albert Crane, remembered by his men as steady and unsuperstitious. On their first day, progress was slow. Each time they poured a load into the pit, the earth seemed to swallow it whole. By late afternoon, they realized that the surface level had not risen at all. "Like feeding a mouth that does not fill," Crane remarked, his note later found in the margin of the work order. The next morning they discovered the gravel heaps scattered across the field, as though flung back out during the night. The project was halted, and the hollow was left as it was. Around the same time, a local photographer, George Elwell, attempted to capture the site for a county archive exhibit on abandoned properties. He used a large-format camera, the kind employed for daguerreotype restorations. When the plates were developed, the image appeared clear, except for the farmhouse ruins, where a faint white figure seemed to stand in the window frame, indistinct yet unmistakably human in shape. Elwell insisted it must have been a trick of light or motion blur, but his assistant, who had been there at the time, swore no one was present in the frame. The photograph was never displayed publicly, and years later it was lost when the courthouse annex burned in 1920. During that decade, the surrounding region suffered worsening droughts. Farmers wrote of cracked soil, of seeds that refused to take rows, and of dust that rolled across the plains like smoke. Historians now recognize this as the early echo of what would culminate in the Dust Bowl decades later, but locals at the time described it differently. They said the earth was remembering. The phrase appeared again in a 1914 diary from a schoolteacher named Ruth Elder, who had taken to collecting folklore for her pupils. She visited the hollow once in April and wrote afterward, "The wind there hums below one's feet, not above." I left with my ears ringing and my shoes damp, though the ground was dry. She died of pneumonia that same winter, and her diary ended up in the parsonage library, where Reverend Redding, now nearly blind, read it aloud to younger clergy as a warning about curiosity. By 1915, the land was officially condemned for habitation, a rare act for the time. County clerks simply stamped the word void across the property sheet. Yet hunters still passed near it, and some returned with uneasy stories. One spoke of seeing flickers under the grass like lantern light beneath the soil. Another said he heard whispering, as if voices echoed through an underground chamber. Nothing ever surfaced to confirm their claims, and in each case, the men who told them later recanted, saying it must have been wind or exhaustion or imagination. Still, the pattern persisted. Every few years, someone would swear they saw the faint outline of a man in work clothes near the collapsed barn, motionless, patient, waiting. By 1917, the hollow was more myth than memory, but its name still carried weight among the few who remained from that earlier generation. The older farmers would fall silent when it came up, glancing westward as though listening for something distant. Some swore the ground there still moved slightly after rain, a slow, shallow rise, like breathing. In 1918, Kansas was a land half swallowed by dust and war news. The influenza epidemic was beginning its sweep, and no one had time for ghost stories. Still, in Clay County, a letter surfaced at the post office addressed to Sheriff of Milford District. It bore no return name, only the words from the Baird property written in cramped graphite. The sheriff, now an aging Bertram Wade, opened it privately. Inside was a single scrap of torn ledger paper, old and stiff with grime. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but deliberate. "The earth is full now. Stop feeding it." Wade dismissed it as a prank and burned the note that night, but his deputy later recalled seeing him ride out toward the hollow at dawn. He returned an hour later pale and shaking, and refused to discuss it. 2 weeks afterward, he resigned. That same autumn, a railway maintenance crew, working several miles north, reported tremors felt during a line inspection. They described the sensation as short, rhythmic shudders, like something collapsing inward. When charted, the epicenter aligned roughly with the hollow's coordinates. The state geologist dismissed the data as instrument error, yet the record remains in the Bureau's 1918 survey log, annotated in Wade's handwriting. Not natural. He had made the note before his resignation was finalized. The following spring, 1919, brought heavy rains again. Floodwaters swept through the low fields and unearthed fragments of wood and iron that drifted downstream. A farmer's boy found one near the bridge, a bent metal hook coated in reddish mud. He brought it home, and his mother, recognizing its description from old county stories, ordered him to throw it into the river. The next morning it lay on their doorstep, clean and dry. The family left town a week later. Meanwhile, the county's property office received a formal request to reopen the case records concerning the Baird land. The request came from a historian at the University of Kansas, none other than Lydia Horn, now elderly but still corresponding with archivists. Her intent was to update her earlier work, Echoes of the Prairie Frontier, for a second edition, focusing on unverified disappearances. The clerk granted limited access, and Horn reviewed the original affidavits, including Reverend Cole's and Dr. Trent's. In a letter to a colleague, she wrote, "I have read through every line again and still find no fraud, only silence." That was her last known correspondence. She died that same year, her body found at her writing desk with her hands folded over a sheet of paper. The paper was blank, except for the word hollow. By 1920, the county declared the area sealed from entry. A wooden barrier was built at the old farm road bearing a single sign, "Property condemned, unsafe terrain." Over the next few years, storms would tear the barrier down again and again until it was no longer replaced. By then, the legend had settled like dust across generations. No longer a warning, just a shadow of a story told by grandparents about the man who listened to the ground. Those who ventured close in the years that followed claimed that after sundown, if one stood at the right angle by the creek, faint light could still be seen under the soil, as though a lantern burned forever where no one remained to hold it. By 1921, Clay County was slowly modernizing. Telephone lines rising along dirt roads, grain silos replacing the weathered barns of a vanished generation. Yet the land where Baird's Hollow had once stood remained untouched, fenced loosely by scrub oak and wild grass. The area appeared on no new maps. When surveyors from the State Engineering Office rode through that summer to mark boundaries for a drainage project, they found their compasses faltering near the site. Instruments spun, horses grew restless, and one man reported a low drumming beneath the wagon wheels. They recorded the anomaly, filed it away under unverified, and continued south. The same year, a retired teacher named Marion Kepler began assembling what she called the County Oddities Register, a collection of old rural mysteries for a local historical society. She tracked down every surviving witness of the 1890s events. The last remaining Doolan son, now in his 60s, recalled his father's warning never to touch the soil near the creek. "He said it feeds on attention," Kepler noted. Her letters to a friend in Abilene reveal growing unease. "I dream sometimes of a man with mud to his knees, standing in the dark, listening. I wake before he turns around." The correspondence stopped abruptly that autumn. No obituary for her was printed, though her belongings were later auctioned in Junction City. Among them, a small wooden box containing soil samples labeled "From Baird's Ground, still warm to touch." The buyer's name is illegible. Throughout the early 1920s, reports of strange tremors persisted. A farmer west of the creek claimed his well water turned black for a single day before clearing again. Another swore he heard hammering from underground after storms. Most locals dismissed these tales, yet in 1923, a young surveyor named Paul Withers documented an incident in his field journal. He wrote, "Here, a tapping, 3 knocks, pause, 3 again. Sound came from beneath my feet, not echo. Earth firm, but it carried rhythm." Withers quit the project after 2 weeks and left for Wichita, later telling a colleague that the hollow felt inhabited. Meanwhile, the memory of the Dust Bowl's early soil studies, those first scientific murmurs of Kansas's dying earth, began finding strange resonance with the old tale of Baird's Farm. Academics discussing environmental decay sometimes invoked it metaphorically, calling it the haunted field. A 1924 university lecture described it as an early local myth reflecting ecological guilt, a story born of crop failure and superstition. Yet even the lecturer, according to his assistant's notes, refused to visit the site himself. He called it a place better left unexamined, for the sake of reason. By 1925, the last standing wall of the farmhouse finally gave way. The collapse was witnessed by 2 road workers who said it fell without wind, slowly, as if tugged downward rather than pushed. When they investigated, the dust still hung in the air, but there was no debris where it should have landed. Only a shallow depression filled with damp earth, smooth and dark like the surface of a pond. The foreman noted in his log, "No sound of impact. Ground took it whole." As new generations settled across the plains, the story of the cursed farmer faded further, surviving only in half-remembered warnings told to children. Still, each decade or so, someone would pause near the overgrown field, listening, certain they'd heard that quiet rhythm again, the slow, patient tapping from far below. By 1926, the hollow had nearly vanished into the surrounding pasture, yet its name endured in whispers among the locals who remembered the old parish days. A narrow road now curved past the site, newly graded for wagons heading toward Milford, and travelers sometimes reported a chill as they crossed the bend even in high summer. A store clerk named Albie Norton wrote to the county newspaper that he had heard a man humming from the ground while resting his horse near the creek. His letter was printed once and quickly removed from later editions. The editor, when asked why, said only, "We don't reprint delusions." Still, in the evenings, when the wind swept low, some swore they heard the same low melody, a mournful tune no one could identify. In early 1927, a prospector named Jonah Weir sought permission to dig near the site, believing there might be iron deposits below. The county clerk denied his request, but Weir went ahead anyway, setting up a small rig with a hand winch and lamp. His assistant, a young man from Manhattan, later recounted that after the third day, their auger struck a cavity. The drill line jerked violently, then went slack, as if it had fallen into open air. When they tried to retrieve it, the reel resisted, pulling downward with steady force until the steel cable snapped clean. Weir stood over the hole for several minutes, silent, before covering it hastily with loose soil and leaving the machinery behind. He never filed another claim. His assistant's affidavit, submitted later to avoid penalty, ends with the line, "The ground took more than the drill." That same summer, the regional railway added a siding track within a mile of the hollow, bringing new workers unfamiliar with its history. One evening, two of them decided to camp near the field for convenience. In the morning, their tent was found flattened, one bedroll empty. The surviving Warren Kerr, when questioned, said his companion had risen in the night, claiming to hear someone calling his name from under the soil. The search that followed found nothing. The case was logged as accidental disappearance, presumed runaway. In the years that followed, the county began discouraging any mention of the hollow altogether. Property lines were redrawn so that no parcel bore its coordinates. On modern maps of the period, the place appears only as a faint contour, an unnamed depression marked by the letter X. Yet for a handful of aging residents, the memory remained sharp. One was Hiram Sloat, the farmer who had once seen lightning lay down the chimney bricks in perfect order. In his final years, he told a traveling folklorist that the hollow breathes when it rains, and that sometimes when the clouds rolled low, he thought he saw movement at the edge of the old barn site, like someone climbing stairs that aren't there anymore. By 1928, Kansas was sliding deeper into drought again, the first taste of what would later become the great dust storms of the 1930s. Fields cracked open, wheat failed, and the air grew heavy with the scent of old earth. Some in Clay County began to recall the cursed farmer once more, a man who had tried to listen to the ground and been taken by it. A schoolteacher wrote in her journal, "Perhaps he heard what we refused to." It would be the last written mention of the name Baird for more than a decade. By 1929, the United States was turning toward hardship again, and in Kansas the land seemed to mirror the mood. Dust rolled across the plains like a dull tide, dimming the horizon and leaving the air thick enough to taste. In Clay County, people began to speak of the hollow once more, though not by name. They called it the place where things sink. That year, a family newly arrived from Nebraska, the Kellers, leased acreage nearby, unaware of its history. Their youngest child, a boy of 7, would later tell his teacher that sometimes a man stands by the barn that isn't there. When asked to describe him, the boy said, "He looks like Daddy, but older, and his boots are wet." The teacher dismissed it as imagination born from loneliness, yet she noted in her log that the child refused to walk near the creek thereafter. Late that autumn, the county surveyor's team revisited the area to mark boundaries for the Keller property. One of the men, a draftsman named Ross Hill, sketched the depression with remarkable accuracy, its slope, its depth, even the remnants of what might have been stair outlines visible through grass. He labeled it subterranean subsidence, abandoned, and moved on. When the county records were reviewed decades later, that page bore a faint watermark shaped like a human hand pressed into damp paper. Archivists assumed a spill. The ink around the mark, however, was untouched. In the spring of 1930, a new drought set in, worse than any before. The Kellers abandoned their homestead within months, leaving behind a single trunk and a plow half buried in dry earth. A passerby found their door open and their well filled with silt, as though the wind itself had chosen to bury them. A note pinned inside read only, "The ground knocks now." That phrase, when recounted by neighbors, sounded eerily like the old testimonies of tapping heard beneath the soil decades earlier. Sheriff's deputies visited but reported nothing unusual beyond subsidence cracks and heat haze. Yet one deputy later confided to a friend that his boots had sunk an inch into soil too soft for drought. Around this time, researchers studying soil exhaustion in the Midwest began referencing the Dust Bowl's precursors, citing the failures of 1890s Kansas farms as warning signs. One small paper in 1931, authored by a young agronomist from Topeka, briefly mentioned a mysterious Clay County field where growth ceased entirely by the turn of the century. It was meant as scientific observation, yet locals who read it saw in those lines a quiet echo of their forbidden story. The editor who printed the paper was said to have received anonymous letters afterward, each bearing only 3 words: "It still breathes." In late 1932, after a series of violent windstorms, the hollow resurfaced, its edges stripped bare of grass, revealing cracked clay and a cavity large enough to swallow a wagon. A farmer passing by at dusk swore he saw faint light glowing within, steady and white. He did not stop to look closer. When a small team came to inspect 2 days later, the opening had filled again with sand and debris, as though it had never been. The event reached no papers, but the following month, several locals moved away without selling their land. Their neighbors said they didn't want to listen anymore. By the time the worst of the dust years arrived, few in Clay County remembered Baird by name. The field, however, remained. It neither yielded nor eroded, a strange island of stillness amid the wind-torn plains. Those who passed nearby swore the air there carried the faint scent of rain, even in the driest season. And sometimes, when the night was still enough, they said the earth below whispered softly, in time with the wind. By 1933, when the great dust storms began to roll through Kansas like smoke from a dying fire, Baird's Hollow became a kind of absence on the landscape. The surrounding fields turned pale and cracked, but the hollow remained damp beneath its crust, the only patch of ground that never seemed to blow away. Migrant farmers heading west on wagons marked the area on hand-drawn maps as bad soil, steering clear of it. Yet a few desperate souls tried to settle there again, driven by hunger more than courage. A family named Haskett built a small shack at the northern edge, unaware of the land's past. Within 2 months, their crops failed and their well collapsed. A neighbor reported hearing Mrs. Haskett screaming one night that she saw a man with no eyes standing in the barn that isn't there. The next morning the family was gone, leaving their possessions behind. Local authorities did not investigate. With the nation in crisis, one vanished family on the plains was hardly news. The sheriff, younger now and unconnected to the old legends, filed the report as resettlement failure. Still, his deputy, a man named George Lee, visited the property out of curiosity. His notebook, preserved in the county archives, tells of a faint vibration underfoot near the center of the field. He described it as a low hum that rises and fades like breathing. Lee's final note reads, "The ground feels aware." He transferred to another district within the month. In 1934, a relief photographer named Clara Densmore came to Clay County to document drought conditions for a regional newspaper. She took several exposures of the hollow from different angles. When developed, one plate showed what appeared to be a faint staircase pattern in the earth, 12 steps, descending diagonally toward darkness. Densmore assumed it to be an optical illusion, but she labeled the image Subterranean Remnant, Clay Coup, in 1934. The photograph circulated quietly among local historians and later vanished, likely destroyed in a flood that swept the courthouse basement in 1941. That same year, a traveling preacher named Reverend Lyle Hurst passed through the area, delivering sermons to displaced farmers. In his journal, he described stopping by the hollow at sunset. "The wind there goes inward, not across. I prayed, but the air would not carry sound." Hurst's writings, published posthumously, became a curious blend of theology and early environmental reflection, suggesting that human sin and the dying earth were bound by the same silence. He referenced the Clay County field directly, calling it the wound that would not close. By 1935, the soil science departments at Kansas State began studying dead fields as part of federal conservation efforts. Among dozens of sites listed, the bared land appeared again, its coordinates slightly altered but unmistakable. The report noted that vegetation refused to grow despite adequate rainfall. Composition normal, but ground remains unyielding, it read. The researcher, Professor Miriam Tate, concluded, either contamination or compaction below surface, possible cavity. Her team planned a deeper survey, but funding was withdrawn after she fell ill during the trip. In a private note, later recovered from her papers, she wrote, "There was a sound down there. 3 knocks, a pause, and 3 again." By the end of the decade, dust had buried most traces of the hollow. The county called it reclaimed. Yet truckers passing on the road at night still spoke of odd flickers across the plain, faint and steady, like lanterns moving beneath the soil. No one ever stopped to see. The war years would soon come and scatter the last who remembered, but the story lingered quietly, breathing beneath the wind. By 1936, the worst of the dust storms had begun to ease, though the plains remained scarred and gray. The hollow, long since reduced to a shallow depression, appeared to rest finally, motionless, its edges softened by drifting silt. Yet when new settlers began reworking abandoned land for the federal resettlement program, one tract worker, Leonard Rusk, flagged the area as unstable ground. In his field log he wrote, "Spade went through easier than air. There's no bottom, only dampness." Rusk was ordered to skip that section, but later confessed to a colleague that he'd returned alone one evening to test the depth with a fence post. He claimed the post sank straight down, swallowed without resistance. "It didn't even tip over," he said. "It went down like it was invited." In the years that followed, government agents avoided the parcel entirely, marking it as reclamation impractical. By 1938, new conservation maps erased it altogether, merging the hollow with adjacent farmland. Still, rumors persisted. 2 construction men repairing road ditches nearby claimed to hear a steady hammering one night after dark. One said it came from beneath the tires of their truck. The other insisted it was echoing from under the field itself. When they returned in daylight, they found 3 shallow impressions in the dirt, perfectly spaced like footprints facing east. That same year, an elderly man named August Leiter, one of the last living witnesses from the 1890s, granted a rare interview to a WPA folklore collector. The transcript reads haltingly but clear enough. "He went under, that farmer. The ground took him because he listened when no one else would. The dirt has memory, son, and it don't forget the sound of a man's breath." When the interviewer asked what he meant, Leiter grew silent and requested the recorder be stopped. He died less than a month later. By 1939, a handful of F students from the University of Kansas visited the site to study abandoned homesteads. Their notes mention finding fragments of glass and iron scattered along the creek bed. One sketch, now faded, shows what appears to be a rectangular outline, a suggestion of the old barn's foundation, and within it, a darker patch of soil. The students camped nearby for one night only. In their final log entry, one wrote, "Heard tapping again. 3 knocks, pause, 3. Wind absolutely still." They left the next morning and refused to return. When the Second World War began, the government commandeered large tracts of rural Kansas for training exercises, but the hollow was never chosen. A memo dated 1942 states plainly, "Terrain deemed unsuitable for habitation or development." Locals said that during artillery drills miles away, the hollow remained unnaturally calm, dust around it undisturbed while the ground everywhere else shuddered. Those few who lived long enough to remember the 19th century said it was better that way. They believed the land had been patient, waiting for silence. By the end of the decade, no structure, no fence, and no signpost marked where the farm had once stood. The only thing left was the wind, and sometimes late at night, a faint sound beneath it, like the dull thud of a hammer on damp wood. It came in threes, always in threes. By 1943, the war had drawn most of Kansas's young men overseas, leaving the plains quieter than they'd been in half a century. In Clay County, the old people said it was the first time the land had truly rested. Yet one evening that autumn, a freight driver named Calvin Brooks took a shortcut across the back road that once bordered the Baird property. His logbook, later recovered from his truck shows, an entry time 9:47 p.m. Stopped near Hollow, saw light moving under field, white like lantern glow. He never made his delivery. The truck was found idling beside the road at dawn, headlights on, doors open, a lantern burning on the seat. Tracks led toward the depression, but stopped at its edge. The ground beyond was smooth, untouched. The sheriff's report filed that week lists Calvin Brooks missing, last seen near condemned farmland. His name was never added to any later census. The incident stirred brief attention from state patrol officers, but wartime shortages kept investigation shallow. The official explanation cited a vehicle malfunction and desertion. Only one deputy, George Lee's successor, a young man named Henry Sloan, filed an informal note to his superior, claiming he'd heard 3 faint knocks under the soil while standing near the truck. His captain dismissed it, instructing him never to repeat the story. Sloan later resigned and moved west. By 1945, the hollow was once again just a scar in the earth, half filled with wind-blown ash and the remnants of dust storms. The government planted drought-resistant grass across much of Kansas, and it grew everywhere except there. Photographs taken for soil conservation reports show a perfect oval of bare earth amid green, a wound that refused to heal. Locals who saw the images called it the open mouth. Some joked that the land was still waiting for its farmer. Others crossed themselves before speaking of it. In the war ended, returning soldiers repopulated the plains. New machinery rolled across fields once thought barren. Towns rebuilt, highways widened, and in the rush to modernize, the hollow's coordinates were quietly paved over and forgotten. Yet truckers driving the new road claimed that, on still nights, their engines sputtered for no reason near mile marker 17, the stretch that once crossed the bared land. Mechanics blamed poor fuel, but one driver told a newspaper stringer, "It's like something underneath is breathing out, slow and warm." The quote was cut before print. The last official record tied to the old story came in 1947, when a surveyor found his compass spinning again near that same stretch of road. His report used language eerily similar to Henry Jasper's from 1910. Ground vibrates faintly, metallic scent in air, wind still, avoid prolonged stay. He added a small sketch of a stair shape descending into shadow before the note trails off mid-line. The report ends with the single word, listening. By 1949, all traces of the cursed farm were gone from county maps, its name erased, its history reduced to the uncertain memories of a few aging residents. Yet the story persisted in their children's whispers, of a man who built a stairway into the earth and went down to hear what the soil had to say, and how sometimes, when the wind died, it still answered. The final mention of Baird's Hollow appears in a 1950 state record. A simple maintenance note describing minor subsidence along Route 30, Section 12. No name, no history, no hint that beneath that patch of Kansas highway lay the remnants of a story older than anyone still alive to tell it. Construction crews filled the dip with gravel, tamped it down, and poured new asphalt. Drivers passed over it daily, unaware that the ground below had once been a field, where even grass refused to grow. For a time, the land fell silent. But silence in Clay County was never a guarantee. Local folklore collectors from the University of Kansas revisited the region in the mid-1950s to record oral traditions of the Dust Bowl era. One tape, recovered decades later, captured the voice of an elderly woman who claimed to be the daughter of a farmhand from the 1890s. Her words, faint under the crackle of the reel, said, "My father told me the man in the barn was still listening when the roof came down." When the interviewer asked if she meant Baird, she paused and replied, "No, he meant the other one." The remark puzzled historians. The transcript ends there. For the next generation, the cursed farmer became a parable told around campfires, a story about greed, loneliness, and the land's slow revenge. Teachers folded it into local folklore lessons. Children dared each other to whisper his name near the old highway bend, where engines sometimes failed without cause. Yet beneath every retelling lingered a quiet unease, the sense that the tale was not finished. A retired road worker once swore that during a maintenance job in 1957 he heard knocking through the asphalt. 3 times, a pause, then 3 again. He told no one until years later, fearing ridicule. When asked to mark the exact spot, he simply pointed toward the western edge of the county and said, "Where the air smells like rain, even wow. And it's dry." Historians who reviewed early testimonies from Reverend Cole, Dr. Trent, and Lydia Horn concluded that the legend grew from fear, drought, and human imagination, the same forces that birthed the great myths of the Dust Bowl. Yet one archivist in Topeka, cataloging the old affidavits, noticed an odd consistency across 50 years of accounts. Every witness, from the preacher to the surveyors, described the same sound, the slow, deliberate rhythm of hammering below the earth. Today, the site where the Baird farm once stood lies beneath a stretch of unremarkable pasture north of Milford Creek. Nothing marks it, no signpost or plaque, only a patch of darker soil that stays damp long after the rain has gone. Locals say that if you stand there at dusk, when the wind falls still and the cattle keep their distance, you can hear something faint through your boots. A hollow beat, steady and patient, like the echo of a man still working in the dark. And so the story of the Cursed Farmer, 1892, a terrifying secret, hidden in a Kansas barn, ends not with revelation, but with that same quiet rhythm, a sound too old to trace, too deep to silence. It waits beneath the Kansas plains, somewhere between earth and memory, still listening,